another episode of the Square and Compass podcast. We are in Arizona, virtually in Arizona anyways, which I've had the chance to I've never actually visited in person. I have done some interviews with some brethren there before. This time I am with Worshipful Brother Valecourt, Scottsdale Lodge, also the Grand Chaplain of the Grand Lodge of Arizona. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, we talked a bit about it offline. But one thing I want to talk to you about, right off the bat, and we can get into some of the medical stuff if you want as well, but your training as a classical singer, as a vocalist, one thing I'm really curious about, the impact that has on your ritual work in a lodge, because I've seen brothers, and I'm sure you've seen it as well, you may even be more attuned to it. You've seen brothers, or at least I've seen brothers, the struggle with the memory work, not so much in the fact of being able to remember the ritual, but just in their breath. And if it's a longer piece, struggling to get through it and when to take those pauses for breaks. I was just curious, as someone who has a professional background, in voice, in breathing and things like that, how has that impacted your ability to perform ritual? Because you were a classical singer before Mason, correct?
Yeah, and actually, to be fair, I grew up on stage. In vocal training, I was involved in a myriad of musicals and additional plays where there were soloist parts, things like that. So acting is a fairly integral part of my experience growing up, but has really been brought back to the forefront with Masonry, particularly after going through my accident. And I was there on the gurney getting ready to go in for a second surgery, which is a full rebuild of my neck after a secondary accident. And the doctor stopped and he said, "I heard you say something about being a vocalist. If that is as precious to you as it is to most vocalists, what I'm about to say next may very well break you. And but it's fair that I need to tell you, you will never sing again." And I sat, I listened to the words that he was saying. I let myself feel it for 30 seconds or so, and then I just came back determined that you do your job and I'll do what I can to make sure that this body works afterwards. And it didn't work. He was right. I could not carry a tune. And for years this went on, but to clarify, I had that accident the week I was elected to receive the degrees. So this was from day one of this desire to become a Mason. And I find that Masonry, our brothers, the lodge itself, it's a rite of passage, but we don't directly govern that initiation piece. That comes from the architect, so to speak. And mine just happened to be a little more apparent or less subtle than a lot of brothers, but all of us are tried in one way, shape, or form to a degree that we have to look at, how am I going to rebuild myself? How am I going to fit into this this society, and also as a new man? How am I going to fit into the world and participate in the architect's plan? And that was a very crushing experience, but it gave me an opportunity to lean on my other training, where my skills with acting were still able to be presented for the brothers. And I'd rather let my brothers of Arizona do the speaking on what I'm able to accomplish in that realm, but I know that it's precious to many when they're able to watch me perform. And I hope and pray for that result. but yes, the background has helped me in presenting the message despite the difficulty with phraseology and our verbiage. The training has been probably invaluable in what it has provided me, but it's also given me constant increasing strength in that realm to return to a place where I do have the capacity that I once had. And as of right now, I just sang for the first time really since all of this went down publicly for a widow's night that Scottsdale Lodge had earlier this year. And I'm certainly aware of where things are not what they once were, but I'm also very aware of the progress that has occurred since then. I'm probably at about 85% of what I once was, which, given that I was at 0 5 years ago, I mean, that's more than miraculous to me.
You used the word perform, right? Performing the ritual. And I really like that word, the use of that word in the context of ritual. And I've actually talked about this with other guests. The moment in a Masonic career where somebody goes from reciting the ritual to performing the ritual, and the difference between the two, and why you're never going to start at performing the ritual. You're always going to start reciting it, but you get to a point where the comfort level, I think, grows enough that it switches to becoming an actual performance. For yourself, was there a moment that you recall where you really feel like you began to actually perform the ritual in Lodge as opposed to just reciting it? And also, how would you, as an actor, as a performer, as somebody on the stage, how would you define perform versus recite?
So, yeah, both good questions. I'm going to ask you to remind me of the second portion of that question here, if you will. Yes, there was and have been, it's by degrees only, right? And we're all progressing by degrees only. Our degrees look very different from one another. Our capacities, our strengths, and even our deficits look very different from one another. But regardless, that by degrees only piece is ever in play. I mean, when we flip on a light switch, that's not a switch. Nothing ever happens. All things are precipitated, and all things are maintained for their lifetime or for their allotted time span, and then all things are devolved into something else. And this is just true of life, period. But when we flip a light switch, that's a series of actions. Do we first decide that we're going to flip on the light switch? Well, I don't know. But at some point we decide to get up and move our bodies through time and space to a place where we have the ability to affect that change. And even when we press the light switch, that's a series of actions that we're going through. And even the continued sustenance of the light itself is a series of actions continuing in their course according to their cause. So when I say yes, there have been notable times where I noticed I was performing versus reciting. I think that's still in evolution for me, and probably for all of us. I mean, there is no point at which the temple is ever completed, right? We're always working towards an end that may be ever elusive, but in that process, we are ever improving our excellence. And the time at which I realized, oh, this is no longer just trying to make sure that I have the words in their proper place up here. It's now something that can be emphasized and connected is purely due to my willingness to use the keys that were given to me in my degrees to delve into what is it we are actually saying here. You know, Old English, Shakespearean intonations, iambic pentameter, all of these things are present in the language that we use, and none of them are overly apparent in a lot of the terminology that they use by today's broad scope education. And so it requires of us some effort if we truly want to know what is being said here. And there's a statement, and I'm thinking it's around between the 25th and 28th degree in Scottish Rites, Morals and Dogma, but where Pike makes the clear, insistent statement that anywhere that there is a tradition referenced, a number referenced, a name out of place referenced, anywhere that our degree seems to pause for highlight, deserves additional effort of digging in. And I found that in the committing of the lectures to memory, that digging process becomes infinitely more accelerated. You know, the first degree its lecture is so cyclically referencing of, you get a mention of something in the first couple of paragraphs that doesn't come to fruition until, like, you know, towards the end when we're talking about virtues. And meanwhile, there are mentions towards the middle that are deeply implicative of something mentioned in the first word or two. And so as we go, oh, that reminds me of, and we make those connections and we go back to those pages and we look at the verbiage that surrounds that, oh, that reminds me of, we have a deep opportunity to discover many, many hidden secrets that are right there in plain sight. But it's in the awareness of there's something under these words that allows the performer to then say, take a breath, make sure that the next words this new brother hears are potent, because there's something for him to find underneath here. So those are the moments when I have noticed the largest lunges forward in my ability to perform, is when I've gone, oh my gosh, this connects to this, which connects to this over here, which connects to this, and brings the whole thing full circle. Now, the second half of that question, forgive me.
No, I mean, I think you touched on it well in your answer. You know, it's that dichotomy between reciting and performing, and what the difference is. You know, even yourself outside of Masonry, but just as someone on stage, an actor, vocalist, you know, the difference between reciting something and performing something. You know, how would you define that difference?
So, and this speaks a little bit more to the bulk of my journey in toward Masonry, but in first grade, I was diagnosed with a very severe case of dyslexia. And in Southern California at the time, 40 some odd years ago, they were not well funded nor well educated on what that was. I mean, they were still trying to determine, how do we diagnose this, let alone this is what we do for it. And so their easy response was, well, send him down to the special ed resource class. And in first grade, I don't know what that means. I just know that I have to leave class when it's time for the kids to read. And, you know, all my friends are saying, ooh, Mikey, yeah, go down to the retard colony where you belong. And kids are mean. And they didn't know what they were doing to me or saying to me, but I'm then hearing them say this and going down to the special ed class And I'm seeing these kids who have cerebral palsy and severe mental, legitimate hurdles and obstructions to overcome, and some of them with physical hurdles and obstructions to overcome, blindness, deafness, dumbness. And I'm sitting here going, well, these are my peers. This must be the group that I fit in. I don't know what's wrong with me, but something must be. And so as I progressed through that experience, I learned that I could avoid a lot of the embarrassment if I went to my teachers ahead of time and found out what material we were going to be studying for the week. And I would, by the time I was moving towards middle school, I was mowing lawns and paying kids to help me get through the material on the reading part. And then I'd stay up till 2 a.m. with a dictionary and a thesaurus and put it all into my own words. And then I would have large swaths of the material memorized for class so that I could perform well enough that the teacher wouldn't know that I had memorized this and that I was reading it for the first time, even though I had probably read the material 40 times by now. Little did I know, these were giving me very valuable skills in leadership, the ability to delegate and to determine that there's a deficit and to follow up and to make sure that people were motivated in equality with the result that was going to come about because of their compensation. And so I was learning really excellent skills that at the time, I'm sure my teachers would have thought were very illicit, but it's how I survived. And so coming into Masonry, there was already, and even in performing, there was already this ability, but also an ability that I think you mentioned it earlier, where our weaknesses arise from, or our strengths arise out of these weaknesses, where these powerful, robust strengths and abilities and capacities would not come about were there not a weakness, something to overcome. And I study religions. I'm in the process of studying for a doctorate in theology currently. And I, in my youth, in my early 20s, I traveled for about 6 years. At the same time I was building a family, my company that I worked for presented a lot of opportunity to move throughout the States. And so I traveled a lot, and I studied many religions, and came away from that experience realizing that every single one of them offers immense and beautiful pieces of hope. And every single one of them has those pieces of darkness that they don't want to talk about. But that premise of realizing that every single one of them brings vast hope made me realize the completeness that Mason really does provide us, that when we comprehend what it is we are teaching one another, and we realize that beneath all of that is a perspective that can value and recognize that every altar is deserving of our reverence, that every sacred book is worthy of our, whether we buy the material in that book for ourselves or not, we can give grace to the beauty that it provides for its people. And in the realizing of that, I think that's where the performance ends, is when we realize that we are not these separate boxes and separate names that we place one another in, and that we are truly infinitely complex mirrors for one another in the strain of the divine. You know, when around the turn of the century, it was a very common thing for a man to remove his hat when he passed by a woman. It was a very common thing for a man to tip his hat when he passed by another man. And yet in Lodge, when do we do that? We only do that at the mention of deity. So what was it these men and women were saying to one another by doing that? The deity in me recognizes the deity in you. And I love and respect you for who and what you are in this world.
How would you define the word sacred? Because you brought up the sacred books, sacred
Sure.
works. Doesn't always have to be a book. I've seen an eagle feather used in place of a book in the past. When initiating First Nations brothers, that word sacred. Especially with your position at the Grand Lodge level. How would you define sacred? Either sacred book or just that word itself, sacred.
I feel really sincere about answering this question. So bear with me while I take a little bit of time. I don't believe that it's purely applicable to a book or even a shaman's fetish, or I feel overwhelming sacredness about my role as Grand Chaplain, which here in Arizona, that's a 1-year appointed role. Any one of us could do this. As Masons, we all pray all the time. And yet, the authority to petition the Maker on behalf of my brothers, I don't know what else to call that but sacred. I believe that the word itself, while we may not think about this fact very often, I believe that it always implies something that's precious, but also something that cannot be attained truly without intent learning and earning on our part. For instance, when I'm mentoring a new young brother, sacred is a word we talk about frequently, in that the words that we say in Lodge, by and large, in this day and age, are not kept as secret as once they were. And yet, they are still just as sacred as they ever were. And so we as individual Masons are truly and deeply charged with a responsibility of knowing our virtues and how to use them as tools in order to protect the sacred nature of what it is we share behind that door. Sure, can somebody go out and find it on the internet? Absolutely. Can somebody even sneak their way into a lodge and find out what it is we say? Probably. But that connection that I was referencing, that we earn only when we have committed ourselves to learning what those words truly mean and the ability to make connections between principles, points, values, morals, and themes. That's where the true knowledge and the true communion of the knowledge truly happens. And so I believe that the deity, that the architect invariably protects and keeps sacred things sacred. We endeavor to put our own safeguards on that. But ultimately, nothing happens that isn't part of the unfolding of a plan that's not ours.
How has your studies in theology, you touched on this a little bit, but how do you think that has impacted either your role within Grand Laws as the Grand Chaplain, but even more generally, just your Masonic journey, because it's interesting that I guess synergy between your studies and your position. You touched on it a little bit before, but just that study, I'm just really curious how it would affect your view of either the fraternity in general and Freemasonry, but also specifically how it relates to your current position. I'm assuming, I haven't spoken to Grand Lodge. One of the reasons for your appointment was those studies. But even in general, how does the theological underpinning impact how you view the craft?
I'm actually personally not really even sure if that was a piece that was taken into consideration or not. Just given where that knowledge was communicated in the process of that invitation. But it certainly has, like you mentioned the word synergy, it has certainly synergistically affected and impacted the role. And even the way that I consider and think about my role, as its effect on my experience in Masonry. Manly P. Hall made the statement in one of his lectures that it's, let me remember if I can pull it out right here. Traveling is the true leveler of mankind, because things are very difficult to hate up close. And when we're up close and personal with a culture, with a behavior, with a habit, with even a belief system, we gain a tremendous amount of insight and perspective into, like I mentioned earlier, those beautiful pieces of hope that every one of us embrace in our belief systems and perspectives and paradigms. And of course, we also get the glimpses into the dark pieces too. But it also thence contributes to our ability to maybe not excuse, but maybe forgive what may be difficult for our own cultural perspective to understand. And so the good outweighs the bad. The good clearly gives us such value that those dark squares that we walk through are worth walking through them.
Those dark squares, right? They can be Masonic in nature. Masonic lodges can struggle, Masons can struggle with commitments. It can just be personal, family, whatever it is, right? There's those challenges that are going to come up, from your perspective. And you can speak for what you've seen in Arizona or just more in general, where do you see some challenges arising for the craft, even just for your lodge or lodges? And what are some of the ways you think Freemasons can, face and deal with those challenges in the coming years? Obviously most people have been talking about, in the past when I asked that question, in the last couple of years, COVID was the primarily the response. Knock on wood, I think that challenge is receding. But what are the new ones you see coming up, and how do you see Freemasons dealing with those?
And I think there's always going to be something, right? Like, for instance, we just touched on those tiles. And we use the term good and evil, right? Considering our lives, and we all walk through those moments of good and evil. But what do those words actually mean, and where do they derive from? The word good is largely couched in American colloquialism. That word was not used near to the prevalence in Old English as it is today. And where it was used in direct correlation to a product of man's mind, reflective of the creative nature in man, coming about due to mind and life, rather than just material efforts. So the word good specifically means man's creativity like unto God's creativity. The word evil, much like a large portion of what certain entities have done with words, has been twisted. And it's been twisted particularly to create some discount to or degradation to the feminine of the cosmos, because its root begins with Eve. Eve caused a dismantling of what was. By her choice, a dismantling of this beautiful state of equilibrium was dismantled and destroyed. And so therefore, the word evil really refers to destruction rather than creativity and construction. And so understanding those words even a little bit better help us to look at those tiles very differently. By the time a master makes it to the east, he now has been through all of the chairs wherein the light was in his right hand. But now he's also made it through chairs where he had to have the darkness in his right hand. And so as a master, particularly a master of the self, we can't avoid the dark squares because they are truly what build us. Those dark squares, every single time I have been in the most difficult, most challenging lesson of my life, I've been in one of those squares. But I didn't know it. I didn't know it until I stepped onto a light square and could now perceive and have the perception of what I had just gone through. And so it's ever so easy for us to even say, oh, well, this guy does such and such, therefore he must not be good. Well, do we know? Do we know what creation he is putting forth into the world? Are we taking the time to find out when we're interviewing new brothers? And meanwhile, when someone's going through those moments of darkness, we're reminded of how we can know a brother in the dark as well as the light. And what does that mean? That means that we are never to lose sight of a brother, even when he is in a state of absolute deconstruction. And we all go through them. Every single day, on some level, we go through those moments. And so I think the biggest danger for us is in giving seed to American colloquialism and not really considering how important and careful it should be for us to unite rather than divide. It's ever so easy to say, oh, well, that's them and this is us. There is no us and them or us and them. There is none of that in Masonry. It does not exist. So even when it arises in the contest between York Rite and Scottish Rite, it's wrong. It doesn't belong here. And I think that's our gravest point for focus, is us versus them. Whether it's us versus them in the old guard versus the new guard, whether it's us versus them in the holy versus the rude, whether it's us versus them in our clubs or our inner circles. We're never going to change that there are circles within circles. We're never going to change that there are inclinations for us to gravitate to those who vibe on the same level or frequency as we do. But there is never a place for us to focus on division in Masonry. And if we look at things like COVID, and there's so much out there right now that is so sickeningly and insidiously politicized. But when we focus on the politicization of those things, we are only increasing the likelihood for division. And so the really messianic skill that we all need to develop is the ability to take a step back from the details that appear divisive to us and say, but there is a much larger story. And in this much larger story, we are never enemies. We are always brothers.
You know, the discussion around division, it reminds me of something I've been thinking about, or trying to focus on, you know, when it comes to Freemasonry, is kind of the tendency for a Mason himself, to kind of divide up the craft into, you know, what's important versus what's unimportant based on, well, you know, or it's even what he considers relevant. You know, like we had my lodge over the summer, one of my lodges over the summer had a refreshment night. And you know, we saw a gentleman come out, a brother, he doesn't attend often, came out to the refreshment night though. And at the end of the meeting, at the end of the refreshment night, I overheard him saying, you know, this is what Freemasonry is all about. It's about the refreshment and spending time with the other brothers. And I've heard other brothers, even worshipful masters, say, you know, Freemasonry is really about the ritual work, to the extent that, you know, there's been some talk of kind of doing away with business meetings almost altogether. Not at the Grand Lodge, not at any Grand Lodge level, but brothers saying, you know, why not just have the master, secretary, treasurer do all the business and just gather the brothers for either social or rituals? Because ritual is, you know, what's unique as compared to other civic groups, really. That's kind of what separates us. And there's that argument. Other people have said, you know, Freemasonry is about its history and maintaining, you know, the records from the past, because 1717, even further back, you know, and this idea, and I've seen this thing where Masons tend to they'll divide up the craft as to what's important, what's not important. Even during COVID, you know, a lot of lodges were switching over to virtual meetings. Harmony still has ours, go-to meetings, and you know, brothers are saying, well, that's not Freemasonry if it's being done virtually, you know, and I really think that there's a type of division you talked about, which is unhealthy, which is, you know, kind of brother divided against brother, York Rite versus Scottish Rite versus, you know, whatever, but, or even, you know, politics seeping into lodge and Republican brother versus Democrat brother, whatever it might be, there's that division. But one thing I've become concerned with is more members dividing Freemasonry up and then picking a side, right? Because to me, it's not one thing. You know, a lodge needs to have a strong social component, but it needs to be good at ritual, and it needs to be good at business meetings, and it needs to be good at, it needs to have a virtual presence. It needs to be online. It needs to think about things like the youth groups, Rainbow, Demoli, like I have noticed, I don't know if it's just a time issue. Men have more demands on their time, so they're dividing it up and just saying, this is what I'm going to focus on, or I'm not sure where it comes from, but that's a type of division I've noticed that concerns me, which is the important things of Freemasonry versus the unimportant. Whereas, to me, they're all important and they all need to be considered as important by the membership up to Grand Lodge.
So let me first say I agree with you, and then I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. Because it has never not been so. Masonry has always been under some form of onslaught that caused that cellular division, so to speak, right? So we've had, you have the Orient of France versus the UGLE, and originally, somewhere, if you traced it far enough back, originally these were brothers side by side. We have ancient free and accepted versus free and accepted, and again, you trace it back somewhere back there, they were brothers right alongside, and and I tend to regard that. I'm sure you're familiar with Alan Watts, but he brings up this statement so frequently of, well, how do we know something was meant to be? Well, because it is, and we cannot have anything occur that was not precipitated by such a long train of events that our minds could never map them all. But regardless, there is a logic and a reason and a rationality to the things that are coming about today. And all of that is under the governance of the architect. Therefore, nothing can come about that won't ultimately result in the conclusion of that plan according to will. And so part of me says, is there a time and a place for it? Well, I don't know. I'm not one of those crusaders fighting that, but that's not to say that maybe there isn't. However, you reminded me of a statement that one of the past grandmasters from California, I believe it was, in the film 33 and Beyond, makes a statement of, I don't know what Masonry is going to look like in 100 years. I know it's going to be here. I know it's still going to be relevant, but I don't know what it's going to look like. And it's so easy for us to, for instance, given my place in generations, I'm part of the smallest generation. 19 million people is Generation X, and I'm towards the tail end of Generation X. Meanwhile, on either side of us, we've got 38 plus million of the millennials, and we've got 58 million plus baby boomers. And these two, particularly because they are parent-child generations, right? They invariably have a hard time understanding one another. And even though much of the behavior in the millennial generation comes about because of the behavior of the baby boomer generation, they still reach a point of difficulty at passing that baton. And so it's been very starkly illuminated recently, where we as Generation X in that small group have a very critical role for the craft of helping to make sure that that evolution happens in a healthy manner. And where are we in time? Did I lose you?
No, I thought that was rhetorical. I in time, in terms of like,
time frames. Are we okay?
Oh, I thought you meant like in Masonically, where are we in time? We got all the time in the world, so.
Okay. So where I was going with this is, let's take, for instance, and this will give you a little insight in what I do in my personal career, but take, for instance, the subject of the dawning of the age of Aquarius. What does that mean? most Masons have no idea what that means, even Masons that are actually really interested in things like astrology. But that song came out at a time when our sun was moving its position where it will arise on the equinox from the Pisces to the Aquarius. Now, what does that mean? Well, geophysically, it has some implications for us, but thematically is what we're actually looking at. And you can say energetically, you can say whatever, but what has been passed down to us from the ancients are all principles and values expressed in themes. And this is true of everyone's spirituality. Morals and values are passed down through themes and stories. So where did this dawning of the age of Aquarius come from other than that song? Well, it comes from the fact that the sun is now moving into the sign of Aquarius. Well, ancient peoples noticed that while the sun is in a given sign, certain effects impact this earth. For instance, we can all tell what the moon does to our water, right? That's pretty clear. It causes tidal cycles for us. Very few people realize what Mercury does to our world, our planet. But as a solid metal planet, its magnetosphere pulls on our magnetosphere when it moves around the sun, and its orbital trajectory is now pushing against Earth's. And so it pulls on our electromagnetic sphere. There are plenty of people that experience the disruption of that, whether it's in their electronics, whether it's in their communication, whether it's in their electromagnetic transceivers that these bodies are. People notice that if they're carefully watching. But these planetary bodies do, in fact, have effects that are mappable and have been throughout epochs passed down to us based on the behaviors that are present while the celestial bodies are in those places. So we can establish some easy understanding of what the moon does, some easy understanding of what Mercury does. Even Venus has an effect on our blood pressures and how our passions feel chemically in these bodies. And so we're not often paying attention to these things, but they do have these results that if we're watching, we can map. The sun holds the pervading theme over cycles on this world. And so it being in the sign of Aquarius, and now, 40 some odd years after that song was written, now we're full swing into the age of Aquarius. And what does that mean? Well, the Aquarian is based on the mythology of Ganymede. Are you familiar with Ganymede?
No.
Okay, so many brothers are not. Even though we talk about mythologies all the time, Ganymede's like one of these tiny icons in Greek mythology. And in Greek mythology, Ganymede is immortal, but is said to be of a race of giants, and is very capable in strength, but also in his wisdom and in his beauty. And Ganymede presents the example of no matter what Ganymede does, he is always doing service of the best kind to humanity, whether that's tending his flock, whether it's making sure that the well is operating. Regardless of what it is, Ganymede is always in service of his fellow man, and thus is considered the most beautiful mortal on the planet, according to Zeus. And so Zeus, while he's out flying as and translations vary, and some he's an eagle, and others he's a vulture, and others he's a hawk, but he was flying and in another form and saw Ganymede in service to his fellow man, swooped down and took him up to Mount Olympus. Now, we know that Mount Olympus has a law decreed by Zeus that no mortal shall enter Mount Olympus. And yet here Zeus was breaking his own law. Why? Because there is a time and a place where we have to look at our old tradition and say, is this actually serving the culture that is present today? And if not, are there times where it is necessary to alter our tradition? Now, there are specific statutory and legislative methods whereby that's to be done. Let's not discard that. We're not all Zeus in a position to just change our own laws. But the old cupbearer in Olympus was no longer serving the gods. Now, that cupbearer brings the gods ambrosia, and ambrosia is what gives them their luster and immortality. And that ambrosia is purely based on, for its growth and its abundance, the belief and the practice of religious principles by the mortals down below Mount Olympus. So for as long as the gods are lustrous and give examples of glory, mortals will love, revere, and worship them, adding to this ambrosia. But when the gods' luster begins to dim because service is not at the core of their sustenance, then the mortals below are not giving to those precepts that the gods represent. We're forgetting them. And sometimes it's necessary to stir up tradition and install Ganymede as the new cupbearer to ensure that the example of service is what we are truly and genuinely basing our actions on. And you mentioned earlier that, like, it's so easy for us to get caught up in the business aspect or the ritual aspect or the whatever aspect, but the truth is we are both physical and spiritual beings. And we have to embrace the precepts and principles that Masonry teaches us about operating and living in this material world. If we don't, well, we risk our own mortality, in fact. If we don't understand the principles of ensuring that a stone block is plumb, well, then when we put our rooftop on, we run the risk of it coming down on our heads that night. And we so often forget where these things, these principles that teach themes have opportunity to draw parallel to ourselves as individual Masons, but also to our lodges and to the craft at large.
How does one determine to use this story, right, to expound upon that, and kind of your more general point? How does one determine, at which point is it that the culture is the issue versus the failure to adapt to the new culture is the issue, right? Because I think, in Freemasonry, the classic joke probably exists in Arizona. I think it probably exists everywhere, right? Is, the toast of the past masters. That's not how we did it in my day, right? There's always a tension, though. I think Freemasonry, perhaps because it's and rightly so, is celebrates its traditions and its ritual and again, dating to 1717, if not earlier, depending on who you read, and it starts to get a bit hazy.
Yeah.
There's always this tension between, okay, at what point does Freemasonry change to try to remain relevant within the culture that exists, versus at what point does Freemasonry not change, but rather try to get the culture to change, to revert it to something that would be more relevant to Freemasonry? There's a never-ending debate, and that debate exists outside of Freemasonry too.
And I think you just touched on why rhetoric is one of our clearly stated arts and sciences. It's not, those other 3 and 4 are not to be forgotten. even though we more acutely bring the Masons' attention to the fifth science, but those other 3 and 4 are not to be forgotten. Rhetoric is how, and logic together are particularly how we bring about these changes, and how these philosophies of profanity versus righteousness arose out of these Socratic circles in Greece. That tension of rhetoric it's necessary. That it not always be easy to answer, and even the tension between the generations of brothers reflect a tension that when we're going through our second degree, where do we walk in that lecture?
I can only speak for Ontario, right? The Canadian side. There's you pretty much follow in all the degrees. You follow pretty much the similar path. The only difference is how you approach the altar, and in each degree, it's different.
So yes, that's accurate, and I didn't mean to imply that piece quite as much. But we walk between polarities, right? We walk between those pillars, and if we were to stretch our arms out and just ever so lightly touch those pillars, we ourselves are literally the balance between strength and establishment, between spirit and matter, between severity and mercy, between coagula and solve. We ourselves are that middle pillar that brings the balance to the craft. And so I think it's easy for us to always point a finger in this Western culture is just obsessed with where does the blame lie? But blame and culpability does nothing to help us actually address the circumstance of, is it the culture? Is it the craft? Is it the craft? Is it the culture? I think none of that actually matters. If we ourselves can embrace the principles in an exemplary manner, like our third degree charge reminds us, then we don't have to worry about what culture is pervasive. Because, it may be trite, it may be cliche to say the fish rots from the head down. But that icon means very, very much to the brothers who are around him. And those icons mean very, very much to the brothers that they're around. And those icons mean very, very much to the brothers that they're around. And the whole thing disseminates as a pyramid. And so, no, our leadership is never above reproach. But if they constantly strived to set the example of being above reproach, we wouldn't be questioning the culture or the craft, because the craft would evolve as it necessarily needs to unfold according to the architect's plan, and the culture would gratefully embrace it. But, and as I mentioned, this age of Aquarius, I genuinely do believe we are in a time of metamorphosis as a craft, as a society, as a world. There is metamorphoses going on in so many different capacities. And the truth is that we're probably never at rest from metamorphosis. But when we recognize that there's a change happening, can we identify what that change is? Some of us might be able to readily identify it, and others might not really even see it in their scope. But does that make Masonry or its principles any less valuable to them? Not at all. They're still providing examples to us about behavior with things like the labor force, behavior in the refreshment and repose. Honestly, You know how often I completely fall down at using that operative tool? So often. So often, my widow son's brothers have to remind me what it means to actually shut the heck up and sit down and enjoy yourself for just a few minutes with your brothers. And that's a precious blessing too. That's an example that we don't ever want to just jettison, because it doesn't fall under this deep searching piece. It's every bit as an important piece of life as the labor and the searching and the spiritual piece. But if we are actually remembering that our brothers have just as much to teach us as we have to teach them in this capacity, I think that every one of us is intended to roll a little bit different. I mean, like, I'm notoriously known for wearing my scars. The truth is, it's because of the injury that broke my neck, and when I broke my neck, and the air conditioning level that most people keep their homes and businesses at, and in driving the vehicle, it's just easier to leave a scarf on. But at the same time, I'm my own brand of weird. And that allows every single other brother to be their brand of weird. And so if we're living true to that, our uniqueness, and also the Masonic principles that we assent to when we're kneeling at the altar, then the questions of culture versus craft really sort of nullify themselves, right?
What do you view as the benefits of uniqueness, or trying to think of the right term? How can a lodge integrate, the uniqueness of the brothers successfully? I'm always reminded of, I think it was like a meme. It was like a Facebook meme, which is always, questionable source of wisdom, I think. But nonetheless, it was, this famous meme where it's basically like a whole bunch of nails, right? And they were all straight, and then one was bent, and then they're like being unique. And I think that's a really important distinction, because I think even in that example, though, they said like being unique doesn't necessarily make you good. The nail was bent, you couldn't use it. But it's like, well, no, that doesn't mean that nail has no purpose. It just means it's not, you can't use it the same way you can use the other nails, but it can still be used in a different way. Maybe it can be used as a piece of art or something to like unique, right? But I think for Freemasons and society in general, but especially for Freemasons, for a lodge, it's really the key is, and you touched on this earlier, at that first point of introduction between a possible applicant or a candidate and the lodge, right? Before he himself is initiated, but is just meeting with them, taking the time to get to know that brother, figuring out, okay, how is he unique? How is he weird? But then how can that be integrated into the lodge to make the lodge stronger, right? And I think it's so important. I think sometimes, one of the places where Freemasonry falls down, at least I'll speak for Ontario, especially, in Ontario, is those early stages where you're meeting a brother, meeting a possible applicant for the first time, not taking enough time to get to know that brother and what that brother could bring and what he could contribute to a lodge and his unique talents and unique abilities, right? And as opposed to kind of a regimented approach of this is our lodge, this is what we do, and this is how you'll be expected to do it as well. Finding that balance of, because there is a level of conformity that's needed in every lodge. There's rules, there's a constitution, but balancing that with uniqueness and, like you described, right, the weirdness that every person brings to the lodge. How do you see, for example, in Arizona, lodges integrating the two things?
So I think I'm going to answer a couple different pieces. First, things I do see that I really love, and then I'm also going to share things I'd like to see in Masonry at large. Masonry in Arizona has a couple of lodges that are empowered with slight alterations, that like traditional observance lodges, that they don't change anything about the ritual in lodge, but before and after they add a few things that really, in my own personal perspective, actually draw attention to a becoming centered before just going into lodge. And I've seen some of those things really impact and affect the likelihood that, say, a brother is going to pull his phone out during lodge, or the likelihood that a brother is going to make a sideways comment during the second half of the third degree, when we should all be remembering that only the actors in the play are speaking. And so some of those cultural pieces that the lodges have embraced have really beautiful impacts. There's been a bit of a debate in Arizona over how a master should manage the moment where a third degree brother is questioned as to whether or not he is a third degree or a master mason. And yet, again, going back to what Manly P. Hall said, that traveling is the great leveler of mankind. And really, Masonry is only a cross-section of humanity. And we can't expect to be anything other than that. And yes, likely we are a little bit more developed cross-section than maybe our social counterparts might be, but maybe not in some cases. But regardless, Masonry is just as diverse as the outside world. And I had a brother come to me recently who said, I want to share this with you because you're one of my closest brothers and you've mentored me through so much that it was not your job to mentor me through. But I misjudged you in the beginning. I thought such and such, and I thought such and such. And it wasn't until I gave you another chance that I realized what an amazing friend you are. And I didn't have a whole lot of shock. I mean, I've been judged in a myriad of ways throughout the course of my life. That's not the new, but it was really beautiful to hear this brother saying that, giving you another chance part, because I think all of us have to go through that. None of us are without assessment. None of us are without some form of bias, given our rearing and our cultivation in our youth. It's just not possible. But we all have to actually consciously say, I'm going to choose to be open here. And every single time I have chosen to be that open person in my life, it has been infinitely more rewarding than I ever imagined. And so I have just adopted that as, this is part of my MO. I always give people multiple opportunities to show me who they are. And then, it would be nice to just trust implicitly across the board. But wisdom tells us that we ought to trust in accordance with what has been shown, right? And so in doing that, you're also catering to wisdom and allowing wisdom to build an understanding of where trust ought to be placed. And so it becomes more of a, I trust you to be this brother. And yeah, you're unique. In some cases, that uniqueness is not going to garner vulnerability from me. But your uniqueness is still infinitely valuable in a different manner. For instance, maybe this brother is really good at remodels, and the kitchen at the lodge is being remodeled this year. Well, that brother may not have all of the perspective that other brothers that I engage with do. But the minute you begin actually opening up, because that brother might have an interest in what you have to share, you start to realize that our symbols are pervasive through all walks of life. And there is always something to stand on with another brother about Masonry. And so even though it might be fairly difficult to discern where you can build a friendship and a relationship with this brother versus that brother, that's not always necessary. But being open well enough that the architect can contribute to your life through other brothers is necessary.
Yeah, and I like that idea of what is necessary in a lodge, right? And or the openness, the necessity of being open to other brothers, right? To work with them, however, whatever that work may be. It could be remodeling the kitchen. It could be working together in a ritual, ritual work. Because a degree is a team sport, right? It really is. It's everybody kind of on the field. I like that idea, and I think if you were to ask what is like the most necessary component of a Masonic lodge, maybe not of Masonry per se, but of a Masonic lodge, right? It's the openness of, it's a necessity of brothers being open to working with each other towards the pursuit of, a common goal or common goals, whatever, whether it's getting through the business meeting successfully, getting through the ritual successfully, the education, right? It's defining that goal and being open to working with others to get that done.
Mm-hmm. And that sometimes requires humility on our part and vulnerability on our part. But the truth, when we step back and we look at the wide swath of men in the world who are injured and harmed and wishing for healing in what we have to offer the world, because when we look out in the world, our role is being constantly evaluated and assessed and critiqued, and yet we still have to find value for ourselves. I've got a client that his wife makes $200,000 a year, but as a man, he then has that feature to contend with on assessing his worth in the home and in his life. And so we're all, whether we're in Masonry or out of Masonry, as men, we are all facing some level of this as our viability evolves in the world and where we fit in the world evolves. But regardless of whether your wife is the leader of the free world or a dental assistant, or your mother, your sister, your daughter, those feminine need a man to be able to direct, to choose, to give strength and a sense of security in a decisive direction. And we don't get to learn to do that out in the world in very many places. But among Masons, we do. We very clearly realize that the masculine role is to direct. And if we can take those lessons out into the world, we have a tremendous audience in the body of men that are all looking for accountability and love. Because most of us grew up in an era where dad either wasn't around, he beat the crap out of us, or even as a Mason, dad may not have known how to relate with his son. In fact, in most cases, it's much more the other old men in society that help us learn how to look at these lessons that our father gave us, how to frame the values that our family taught us to value, or to change them. And this being involved in a system of other old men that can impress values, moralities, principles, and themes, and yet still allow us our own sense of weirdness in all of it, our own uniqueness. I think almost every man that you would ask would say somewhere deep inside in a vulnerable place, he is looking for that. And so the more we exemplify our ability to be non-critiquing of one another, our ability to listen to another brother through what they're expressing without immediately applying bias, the more we exemplify to other men in the world that this is a place that they can receive that.
It's that idea of two dads, right? I think it was Chuck Palahniuk said it, the guy, the Fight Club author, I think.
Chuck Palahniuk.
There you go. Yeah, the idea of like you have your father you grew up with, your dad, or whatever it is, the masculine influence, your grandfather, whomever it is, you have your dad. But then once you reach your teenage years, then you usually develop like a second father, in the sense of like a coach or a mentor or a teacher, or there's somebody who kind of continues those lessons forward. There's this idea of like the need for a secondary mentoring figure to come along as somebody is, leaving, they're growing up to a point where they're leaving home, they're leaving the house, but they're still in need of guidance. But in fairness, it's probably true for, when you're 50 and 60, you probably could still use a mentor at some point, right? I'm not sure if that need ever necessarily goes away.
I think you're right, actually, because there was a brother up here that I saw in Prescott this weekend that when I first came into Masonry, I was a very different person. There has been a very clear Phoenix style transformation. And this brother loves to talk about that with anybody he's introducing me to. He loves to focus on the transformation that took place. But in truth, we're all always going through deaths and rebirths all the time. And when we say that we strive to recognize death as a kind messenger and not a grim tyrant, how often do we think, oh, I could do that today? Today, I could realize that allowing a death on this behavior in my life gives room for me to begin applying this behavior in my life. Then we realize that the entire cycle is happening on a microcosmic scale almost every minute, and I think that willingness to allow the death to be, even though we can't escape grief with any death. In fact, it was a statement of Socrates that, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, so please don't quote me, but it's something to the effect of, every man who truly studies philosophy is studying the art of how to die. And he wasn't meaning the great initiation of death, as he called his own death. He really was talking about every single day. Every single day we have opportunity to go, shoot, you know what? I wasn't all-knowing yesterday. I think I'm going to do a little better today.
And that is a very good lesson for life, but also particularly applicable to Freemasons, and some of the perhaps the overarching lesson of our degrees and our initiation process. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me all the way from Arizona, and also, just going through, I read your bio on the Grand Lodge Arizona's website. I read some of what you wrote in Scottsdale, just the work you do for the craft in a relatively short period of time too. work with the widows nights and stuff. It's just it's awesome to see, and thank you so much for all the work that you do. Whether you are helping Freemasonry in Arizona or Ontario or parts in between, right? It's all Freemasonry, and it's just magic. So thank you so much for all the work you've done.
Thank you for having me. I deeply appreciate it. I don't think that there's any reason to give this caveat, but I just wanted to make sure that we clearly state that any opinions are purely mine and not the Grand Lodge of Arizona's, just to be fair.
And I should do the same thing. And I never say it, although I always write it down on the description, right?
Yeah, I know.
I don't speak for any Masonic group or my lodge. I just speak for me. And it's where it comes promotions. And thank you so much again for your time.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And thank you for having me. Reach out anytime. I'm sure there'll be future occasions where we can share.
I would love to. I'd love to visit Arizona. It's on my bucket list. I never had a chance to visit any lodges in Arizona or even the state itself. The closest I've probably been is California, which I'm not sure. Well, I was in Vegas, and Vegas is close to Arizona, I think. I'm trying to think of my American.
Yeah, I mean, we're like about eight hours away from Vegas by driving, but we are entering the season when you actually might want to visit Arizona versus 2 months ago. But don't worry about housing or anything. You come here, you get here, and you let me know. We'll take care of you.
Much appreciated.